Hi everyone, and welcome back to the one man wheezing and creaking, moaning and groaning, snoring and farting, belching and barfing, no waffle, no frills, 15-minute bedtime story. Now, tonight we're going to have something a bit different. I am going to do it tonight out of my comfort zone. I'm going to try and do tonight's story unscripted. Okay, if you've been here before, then that's fantastic. If you haven't, then thank you for joining me and we can have a look at it tonight. And I hope you'll stick around. But anyway, be warned, tonight's story isn't a very nice one. It's not for children. I couldn't find my usual little bits of comedy to put in tonight. So I'm going to, because it's a serious one, so I haven't added any. There's no waffle, no frills, so no script. So tonight we are going to do the 1948 murder in Blackburn at the hospital, Queen's Park Hospital, Blackburn, and we will start with the story. 9:30 midnight on the 15th of May 1948, nurse Gwendolyn Humphreys was washing up in a small kitchen in the Queen's Park Hospital in Blackburn, next to the children's ward, which I believe was called CH3. Now, she had 30 minutes earlier entered the ward to look after a little boy who had been crying. She sort of looked after him a bit and stopped him crying, and he had settled down, and she had gone back to work. Well, a short while later, she'd heard a girl's voice shouting or crying, so she'd gone back into the ward. She'd taken a trip down to the very end of the ward, where there was a porch that went out onto the grass that was always left unlocked. She'd gone out the door, had a look around, see if there was anything suspicious out there, and there wasn't. So she'd walked back to where she'd been working, and now she'd started on getting the children's breakfast ready for the next morning. Now, she'd been doing that. A bit later, she felt a bit of a draft coming from somewhere. And about 1:15, she then again went into the ward and straight away noticed that something wasn't right. One of the cots that was occupied, which was occupied by a nearly 4-year-old girl called June Ann Devaney, who had been in the ward for 10 days with pneumonia. Now, she had got better, and she was actually going home to her parents that very morning. And I believe that was her father, Albert, and her mum, Emily. And she had a couple of brothers, and also she just got a very newborn baby sister. They're a nice family, all living in Princess Street, Blackburn. Now, straight away, Nurse Gwendolyn realised that the sides of the cot were up, so there was no way that June would have been able to get out of the cot without putting the sides down. So somebody had lifted her out. Also, there was a bottle of water under the cot, and when she'd come in last time, that had been on a trolley at the very end of the ward. She also saw that there was a footprint. The floors were, even though it was a bit of a basic hospital, the floors were immaculate and were polished every day. And there was a stockinged footprint in the polish. Now, Gwendolyn, she looked around. She was in a bit of a panicky state, but she looked around for 30 minutes before she got in touch with the night sister, and they rang the police. Now, the police arrived, I believe, at 1:55, and they started a search of the grounds. And at just after 3 a.m. they came across, unfortunately, they came across the horrible sight of a little girl face down on the grass next to the wall, boundary wall. It was about 300 feet from the ward. Now the wall was all splattered in blood. June was laying there, her night dress was blood stained and all ripped, and it was pushed up over her waist. She had awful wounds to her head and blood poured from her nose. She'd also got like scratches, like fingernail scratches on her ankles. Now the Blackburn Police Force chief rang the person above him, which is the Lancashire Police Chief Constable, and he asked for a couple of things. Now, one was what he needed straight away was he needed a fingerprint. He needed a fingerprint expert for the bottle, and also he needed Scotland Yard. He knew he needed Scotland Yard. Now, interesting fact here is that if you wanted the services of Scotland Yard, because the Met was supposed to be the best at that sort of thing at the time, if you got them in straight away for a case, they would take the case and they would take any costs that it cost to do the case. If you decided that you thought, well, I'm pretty good, I think I can solve this, and then realised that you were basically a crock of shit and you couldn't, and then you got the yard in, then you paid. So they called him in, and a few hours later, Chief Inspector Jack Capstick and his sergeant arrived at the place where the crime had happened, and straight away they were devastated by seeing June's injuries. Now, I've got to refer to my notes here because Capstick said, after first seeing her body, "I'm not ashamed to say I saw her through a mist of tears. Years of detective work has hardened me to many terrible things, but this tiny pathetic body in its nightdress, caked in blood and mud, was something that no man could see unmoved, and I swore standing there in the rain that I would bring her murder to justice." Now that was, you could tell, and it did have a big effect on a lot of people who worked on that case. Anyway, at the autopsy, Dr. Bailey, he said that June had been brutally raped. She also had a bite mark on her back, but she had died basically by being swung by her ankles into the wall. Now, this fractured her skull in 2 places, which caused her to go into shock, plus hemorrhage, and she died. Now, Dr. Bailey clearly thought that this was the work of a complete madman, of which probably everybody thought there was. Now, the police haven't got a lot of evidence, but they did manage to find a bloodhound which managed to find the place where the murderer had entered the grounds. Now, there was a place called the Delph where a part of the wall had fallen down, so it was easy to get in. You didn't have to climb over the metal spikes and that. And they also had a footprint, a stocking footprint, which was definitely an adult's because it was 2.5 inches. And also they had the bottle, which had clear fingerprints on it. Now, Capstick, I reckon he sounds like a really, really good detective to me, because he made a fantastic, amazing decision not done before, that all the males over 16, he decided that he was going to get them all fingerprinted, because he decided that the guy was local. He was local because he knew about the Delph. He knew that was the place where there's a part where the wall was down where he could get in. But he also knew there would be a public outcry about this fingerprinting thing. So he asked the mayor of Blackburn for help in getting the public's help voluntarily. Now the mayor, he agreed, but he told Capstick that he would have to agree to destroy all the prints after the case closed. Now this Capstick decided he had no choice. He needed this, and so he agreed to it. And the local paper put it in their issues that the interests of the public would be safeguarded by this, right? Anyway, the plan was to use the electoral rolls. And so a load of team of police officers went out with their fingerprint cards and their little ink pads, and they decided they were going to work through the list. Well, after 2 months, morale was getting a little bit low because they'd taken over 40,000 prints, and it really had begun to look like Capstick's idea that the man was local was going to be basically a crock of shit. So anyway, somebody in that team had a fantastic idea. The search so far had all been of people on the electoral roll. Now, what about if there were some people who weren't on the electoral roll? Now, these would include people who had been recently demobbed from the Army, Navy, Air Force, exactly, all them, who were not currently registered to vote. But even though it was 1948, Britain was still in rationing from the war. And Blackburn had recently issued some new ration books. So what they did was they compared the electoral roll with the ration books and found that there was over 200 people missing from the electoral roll list. Now they managed to find all these people. And right, just let me look at my notes again, because I need to look at my notes here to get the right number. And a few days later, fingerprint I would imagine 46253 means 46,253 proved to be a match for the prints on the bottle. Now, the name on that card was a man called Peter Griffiths, a 22-year-old who lived on Burley Street. And the reason that he wasn't on the electoral roll was he'd just been demobbed from the Welsh Guards. He hadn't joined up till 1944. He'd fought in 45 in Germany in the push to Berlin, but he'd stayed on till 48. Now, this is probably so that he could work in the new setup of the new Jewish state of Israel in Palestine. And then he came out in 48. Anyway, on the evening of Friday the 13th of August 1948, Griffiths left his home and was walking down Burley Street when Inspector Capstick and Barton stopped him and arrested him for the murder of June Ann. Now, Griffiths was wearing his battle dress, his army battle dress, because it was now the only outer piece of clothing that he'd got, as his demob suit, which was covered in blood, had been taken to the local pawnbrokers by his mother. Now, funnily enough, even though it was covered in blood, neither she or the pawnbroker had noticed that. So they said. Now, of course, Griffiths denied that he had ever seen June, and he also denied that he'd never ever been to that hospital. But when they got in the car, he suddenly asked Capstick, is it my fingerprints the reason why you came to me? And Chapstick said yes, and he replied, well, okay, if they are my fingerprints, I'll tell you all about it. Which, of course, he did. Now, I'm not going to read out his full statement here because I'll tell you, some of it is true and some of it is complete fantasy. So I'm only going to tell you what the bits that I think, or the bits that are true. Okay, so what is true is that he indeed was a big drinker. He drank that night 13 pints of beer and 2 double rums. Now, unbelievable. I don't know how he was still moving around after that. Never mind what he did. Anyway, when he flagged down a man called Bernard Reagan to use his taxi, and he asked to be taken to the Delph. Now, that's the place where the wall had fallen down, remember? Yeah, and he got there, and this is a man with 13 pints and 4 rums in him. Anyway, he got to the porch door at the ward, and he took his shoes off at the door so he could sneak inside. So he knew, on his way, he saw the trolley, he picked up the bottle in case he needed a weapon. He got to the cot, he took June out, and he brutally raped the poor little girl. Okay? Now, it's funny, that bit he doesn't mention at all in his statement. But then, after he'd done this disgusting thing, he had to stop her crying. So he just grabbed her by the ankles and swung her head first into the wall. Now, this man is just evil. He then calmly left her there, walked back, he got his shoes, and he walked home through the back streets of Blackburn to get home. He calmly took off his shirt and tie and slept on the sofa. The next day, he got up, had his breakfast, went out, went to see a movie at the cinema, and on the way back, he saw headlines in the newspaper about the murder, and he said he felt absolutely nothing. Okay? Okay, well, anyway, a bit about, I don't really want to talk about this guy, but anyway, Peter Griffiths was 22, he was 5 foot 10 inches tall, and apparently he's not bad looking. Apparently when he was 6, he fell off the back of a milk float and injured his head. Apparently he didn't tell anybody he'd hurt his head. He just felt he'd come home and he's sick. His parents didn't find out till a week later, till one of his mates told him what had happened. But because they would have had to pay to go to the hospital, they let it go. I don't know, people always say psychos, bangs on the heads. There's always some excuse. Anyway, a bit later, at 8 years old, he was admitted to hospital for incontinence. But strangely, he ended up staying in hospital for 2 years. 2 years for incontinence. Weird. After leaving school, he was in trouble with the police at least 4 times for stealing. But the magistrates were very lenient in them days, and he served no time in prison at all. As I've said, in 1944, he joined the Welsh Guards. He did fight in Germany in the push on Berlin, and he was injured, but there are no details of his injuries. He stayed on in the army until 1948. He got demobbed. He went home to live with his father and stepmother and siblings in Burley Street, and he ended up working at a local flour mill on nights, but he'd also taken to drinking, and he drank very, very heavily. His trial opened on the 15th of October 1948. The evidence was overwhelming. And even without the confession, and Griffiths, he just sat there. He was totally disinterested in the whole proceedings, by everything. His defence did try to play the insanity card, but the jury just was not having any of it, and they only took 25 minutes to find him guilty. The judge sentenced him to death Griffiths paid no attention at all. He was completely uninterested in the whole thing. And on the morning of 19th of November, Griffiths was hung at Walton Down in Liverpool by the famous hangman Albert Pierpoint. Now, Pierpoint said for some reason he died like a soldier. Well, I don't know what you think about that, but I don't give a monkeys. And just as an end bit, also afterwards, Capstick was as good as his word. All the fingerprint cards were pulped, apart from 500. Those 500 were for people who wanted to keep them as a souvenir. So, there you go. Anyway, I don't know. What did you think of that? That was a particularly nasty crime. You know, not very nice. Got to really feel for June and her family. I'd like to thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll carry on listening and maybe leave a rating and a review, either with if you're on here, if you're on YouTube, or if you're on podcast on all platforms. I'd like to give a shout out to Debbie Q of The Right Shoe podcast. She does some amazing stuff, and she's always a lovely lady to talk to. Fantastic. Geezer K and Frizzly Books, her podcasts are fantastic. Her books and Bundy and Dharma are fantastic, and the way she does her goodies in her store, her pictures and everything, and bookmarks. Lindsay have stolen from me. Great podcast, so good that I bought a t-shirt, which I am actually wearing with pride. And for the YouTube video, I am going to wear it for that, Lindsay, I promise you. And I'm going to check out, so anybody, look for her fantastic podcast. She's got a lovely voice. Check out her cool merch. Anyway, that's enough waffle from me. Sleep well, soon be Christmas. Oh, looking forward to that rum. Can't beat too much, Captain. Don't have nightmares. Don't forget, not everyone in this world is as mad as a box of frogs. Sleep well.